All right, the next segment we're going to talk about, Patrick, is a bit of a GDP update. And, as everybody knows who watches this show, Real Estate Investment Network believes that GDP is the first driving force towards real estate prices. So that's why we track GDP so much, Patrick. And this really goes down to the community, goes down to the region that you're investing in. But we got some GDP numbers that we're going to be showing on this episode in terms of some general update. And I love the fact because there was a prediction I made a few months ago that I think is coming to fruition. I'll point it out to you when we get there, Patrick, and then you can measure my over under. But let's talk GDP and show some charts to get things started, Patrick.
Well, here it is. We're starting to see that GDP is slowing down. GDP per capita is coming down. But let's just really shine a light on GDP, which we've done many times before. Here's the fundamental problem with Canada. And that is that our R&D is not really growing. Our manufacturing is not growing. Our productivity overall is flat. Our import exports are flat, and they have been for years. We are a consumer debt-driven economy. That's just the reality. We've talked about it for years now, JG, and especially in after COVID, when we started to see the shift in the housing market. Our economy is being driven by the housing market. An increase in rates, an increase in the cost of housing is slowing our economy down. That's the primary slowdown. Now, yes, retail sales have gotten a little softer in some sectors, but ultimately, when we look at GDP in Canada, you only need to look to the housing market and consumerism to say, okay, GDP per capita is slowing down. And one of the reasons is because people just aren't spending money. They don't have it to spend many. So that's what we're seeing. So that's my background or my thought process, in what's obvious in Canada when it comes to GDP.
Just so everybody knows, real GDP, the difference between GDP and real GDP is real GDP, they back out inflation. So if I'll give you a perfect example for those that don't know, Patrick, if GDP is running at, say, 2% and inflation is running at 3%, that's real GDP of -1, because the inflation is in fact contributing to the GDP more than the actual GDP. So that's the concept of real GDP for people that don't know. And then I do think part of this, Patrick, as well, is we've had such a population influx in the last little bit that this is also affecting these per capita real GDP growth, because we've had, for this particular chart, we've had two things that have really been working against this chart, which is, number one, our population has been growing. So the per capita part is really increasing. The real GDP is shrinking because inflation, when you back out inflation out of our GDP growth, it's actually negative. You can see it there. So as a result, this chart looks the way it is, which brings me to my prediction that I made, probably about 12 months ago. We'd have to have the producers go pull it up. But I said, Patrick, and all along so far, don't forget that everyone has says that we haven't had a recession. We're not in a recession. And you've floated with the idea of maybe we are, maybe we're not, and so on and so forth. The point is this: I said 12 months ago that I bet you some of these numbers are going to get revised after the fact, and what's the news that's going to come out is the recession's over and it actually has passed already. And I think this is where this sets up. That's where I think this is going.
Yeah, I don't think so, but we'll see. The thing about GDP forecasts, GDP is generally their forecast, and then of course they revise. That's always it, because it's lagging. Where we have to start to pay attention in terms of GDP and what's happening economically. GDP, right? When we have positive GDP, it means people are working. So what we really have to watch for are the employment numbers. So when we start to consider, we still haven't been hearing a lot of announcements. A lot of the banks are starting to cut staff back. We're starting to hear about that. We know that in the construction industry, labor's more available. That's because builders have touched the brakes and they're not building as much. So depending on what province you're in and actually what city, we go back to the regionality of things. Ultimately, GDP is only one part of the puzzle, and then we can sort of look at it and start to say, okay, what are we hearing about what's going on in the unemployment world? Are people working? Are they getting jobs? Are they working 2 or 3 jobs? So what's happening in the workforce is a big factor of what drives us economically.
Interesting, Patrick, just because I want to jump around a little bit. The Canadian bond yields The 5-year bond yield has come down a little bit. We were, I think the last time we shot this show, we were probably like at 4.4 almost,
Yeah.
creeping up on 4.4, 4.5. And now we're down to 4. And hopefully we can break that 4, just so everybody knows. The reason we track the Canadian 5-year bond yield is that's what generates mortgage rates, just so everybody knows. It's not the overnight lending rate from the Bank of Canada that generates 5-year fixed term, 5-year fixed rates. That comes from the bond yields, which is why we track this so much. So fingers crossed, Patrick, this got to go down.
Yeah, well, and there's something to be said about we talked about earlier about just how messed up the world is right now. And never has there been a time, I think, statistically, is that where bond yields have been this all over the map. I mean, they're not generally this, there's not this big a differential in them, right? So it's like they're up, they're down, and on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week, well, day-to-day, let alone a week-to-week or month-to-month, bond yields are generally a lot more static and predictable. And right now, because of the uncertainty, they're all over the map.
As I pull this up, Patrick, what's interesting is you look at the 5-year bond yield for essentially the max amount of time that this chart shows, which this started, I think, in the 1986. You could see that essentially, by the way, the average has been, well, not the average, but where we are now, the last time we were at these levels of just over 4 is essentially right before the great financial crisis. And from that point back, we were always at this point or above this point, except for a brief period here in like 2005. Essentially, we were always above 4. And then since the great financial crisis and the era of cheap money, which really boomed real estate, by the way, we've been under that 4, where the average was probably like under 2.
Right. So let's be a little bit cautious here, because when you look at the dramatic increase, look at the speed of which those yields, like, look at that dramatic. I mean, that's like went boom, it was exponentially exploded up in a very short period of time, and a lot in a very short period of time. That's part of what is causing a lot of the drama, a lot of the uncertainty, a lot of what the hell's going on, because this is an indicator of what's happening in the uncertainty in the market. And of course, there's never been this kind of a dramatic. If you even look at the chart you got in front of you, we start to see where after GFC, it dropped quite dramatically, fairly quickly, but nothing compared to the rise and the speed of which it came up here.
But Patrick, you've been investing since 2000. So here we are in 2000. Let's go back to this roughly. I think you started investing around that time. The 5-year bond yield was at 6.5, somewhere between 6.5, which was the peak in 2000, which was the kind of the tech boom, if people were around that long and remember. And then it kind of got down where it kind of averaged out at roughly about 4, exactly where we were. So kind of tell me a little bit, Patrick, of what was the interest rate environment of the banks, of the lenders for real estate. What kind of rates were you paying back then between 2001 and 2007? What was it like?
Well, the rates were higher.
I was, as you know, I was in diapers. So,
yes, exactly. Well, the number one, it was easier to get a mortgage. Let's just say that, far easier. And if you were in Alberta, as a matter of fact, you could assume a mortgage without even talking to the bank. It was just like, got it, we take it over. Those days are gone. The point is that the difference in price of a house back then, I was paying, let's say, 6% or 6.25% for a mortgage, but I was buying a house for $145,000 that today is worth $400,000. So, you have to look and keep it, I guess, you have to make things relative. And this is the mistake, or this is the story that people are telling you. Well, we were 18%. Yeah. And houses were $75,000. So you can't keep it. You got to keep things relative. The problem isn't today is that the rates are at 6 or 7%. That's only a part of the bigger issue, which is what does it cost to buy a house today in terms of, relative to wages and salaries. And that's, when you look at household income versus the price of a home, it's a dramatic shift.
Yep, absolutely. So anyways, fun facts. A little bit on GDP update. That's really good. Patrick, any final thoughts before we wrap up this section?
No, not much other than we have to pay attention again. When we look at GDP, we know it's lagging. If you're as an investor, or if we just want to pay attention to what's happening economically, we have to look at those employment numbers. As long as people are working, it can get pretty ugly, but they still manage. Okay. They still manage. It's when you don't have a paycheck and rising costs and the economy's melting down, that's where things get to be really problematic. We're not there, but we have to pay attention to that.
What is the unemployment rate right now in Canada, Patrick? Do you know?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know. I usually kind of pay attention to it, but I want to say it's still well under 6, probably 5.5 is my guess, 5.7. I haven't looked recently. I look at regional numbers, so.
Yeah, and that's that. And by the way, that goes for everybody. We often talk about GDP, we talk about population, we talked about employment, unemployment. You got to make sure you do the research on your individual market. You should, by the way, be using tools like the DI Vault, which is an artificially intelligent, incredible tool that we've launched recently. And check that out, di-vault.com. You can sign up for an info session, but use these tools, which makes research so much easier. The artificial intelligence does most of the work for you. It's incredible. So check that out, folks, as we wrap up this section.
Well, I want to shine a light on the technology part of it, because not only is it make it easier, it's more accurate, it's more efficient, and it's more current. I mean, that's the biggest issue I think we have with looking at numbers out of StatsCan or Conference Board of Canada, or even from the banks. When you're using technology, it's almost well, in many cases, it is real time.
Well, in our case with the DI Vault, the information is updated every single hour compared to these kinds of charts that you're seeing here. This information could be 4 weeks old, 6 weeks old, sometimes 8 weeks old, Patrick. And that's because it's only published so often. By the time it gets through everything, it just takes a long time. This technology gives you access up to the minute, one source, one screen, incredible dynamic data for you to make real investing decisions as a real estate investor.
Yes, 100%. If you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.
If you want to see more stuff like this, click here. If you want to see the entire show, click there.